Before we sort of dig into, some of the more specific films, I'm curious if there, for you, is, a guiding principle that over the course of your career you sort of developed as you embark on each of these incredible world-building excursions.
My main guide has been directors. I've worked with amazing directors, starting with Terrence Malick and Brian De Palma, and David Lynch, Alejandro, and now Marty Scorsese. It's just been, I think of myself as one of the luckiest designers working.
Well, I mean, to exactly what you were saying, I mean, aside from the incredible films that are in this series, and we're talking about Phantom of the Paradise, we're talking about Carrie, we're talking about Mulholland Drive, The Tree of Life, Causeway, The New World, The Thin Red Line. How do you become the person who is what seems to be like this preeminent creator of these historical worlds with such authenticity and such uniqueness? I mean, where did you sort of get started to approach your job from that perspective, as opposed to any other way that many other production designers do?
I don't know the answer to the question exactly, but I started building forts as a kid, and I did it with such passion that when I got involved in films and I didn't quite know what an art director or a production designer did, I just put as much passion and time and care into the projects as possible, and I think that got the attention of some, it kept me working with Terry for most of my career, and my work with Terry has excited other directors, and it's just snowballed into a kind of a wonderful life in film.
There's such incredible detail in these films. Do you consider, have you always been like a student of sort of like historical detail, or is that something that came out as a result of the challenges that you were given by these filmmakers that you worked with?
My attention to detail came out of the films I was working on and my interest in history, but also the knowing that films last. I mean, you'll be seeing this week some films that I did 50 years ago, and you can't slack up. You got to deliver. I mean, every film I wish I'd had more time and more research, and I regret it if I ever hesitate or don't do something that I could have.
Well, I'd love to start with Badlands being this kind of incredible first collaboration. I mean, it's such an incredible movie. Can you talk about how you first met Terrence, and how you two fell into lockstep as collaborators?
Terry was a student at the American Film Institute, and my best friend David Lynch was there, and I used to go there for seminars and stuff, but a friend of ours, Bill Scott, was also working there, and he told me that the student, Terrence Malick, was going to make his first film, and it was a period film, and I'd been doing films with the Corman brothers, and they were not period films, and I thought, boy, that would be fun. And Bill arranged a meeting with Terry, and it was a really simple meeting. I went in, and I read a little bit about the project, and basically said, can you start July 10th? Or we want to start July 10th, can you do it? And I said yes. And when I went out there, it was the first time I'd seen the passion of an artist, also as a director. And he did things very unorthodox, not like any of the directors I'd worked with on the Corman films. And that excited me. A lot of the crew, because we had had experience doing movies, thought that he was, doing it wrong. And I thought how inventive he is. I mean, we would be getting ready to shoot, and he'd look over there and see a perfect light, and he would just move the whole company over and shoot that. Or he'd see a bird, and he would shoot. He was always responding to what was around him. And at the end of the film, the actors and the art department were the only departments that were totally complete from we started and we finished, but everyone else had changed out several times. We had 3 cinematographers. We had everybody, every crew member kind of would drift off to something they thought was more important. But I stuck with Terry, and he's just such a great friend, but more than that, he was such a great teacher, inspiration, and exciting person to be around.
Well, you talk about sort of his responsiveness and his intuition. I'm curious what maybe, was there a lesson to take away that you said, I'm going to make sure that I'm prepared no matter if he wants to film a bird or whatever little digression that may be occupying him?
Terry is probably the most brilliant person I've ever met, and he's very humble. And I keep trying to think of something that he hasn't thought about, and it's pretty difficult because he's always a few steps ahead of everybody else. A lot of the films that we made later, he started working on before we even did Badlands. And bits and pieces would come out, and he was always like shooting footage of eclipses or wind or animals, and saving them for the films that he wanted to make.
Well, Days of Heaven, which they're showing an incredible 4K restoration of, I think in the next few days. You told a story back in the green room that I want you to retell out here, because it was, basically he told you he wanted you to build a house in several weeks or a month.
When I first met Terry on Days of Heaven, he gave me a book. Showed me a picture of a Victorian house, and he gave me 2 books on harvesting wheat, turn of the century. And he had this idea that we would build this house like out of theater flats, and we'd go across the country and set it up on wheat fields. And then they would harvest it, and we'd go to a new wheat field, and then they'd harvest that, we'd go to a new wheat field. But I explained to him that I can't build a house that we could move easily because we had no money. And we ended up looking for tall wheat, and by the time we found it, we were all the way up in Canada. There was no further place to go and no later wheat to be harvested. But the Hutterites who we rented the field from said, we're gonna be harvesting that wheat in 6 weeks. There's no way we can't do it because it's when it's ripe. And Terry said, well, I need to shoot it for 2 weeks before they harvest it. And I said, well, great, you can be shooting the wheat, we'll be building the house. He said, no, I need to see the house in the background. I said, okay, we'll build the front of the house and we'll work on the inside. And he said, no, I want to also shoot the inside looking out at the wheat. So I was 27 years old and kind of new to filmmaking, and I said, okay, we'll build it in 4 weeks, not knowing that it's impossible to do. And I brought 9 friends up from LA that were carpenters because there was no film industry in Canada at the time. And we built the house in 4 weeks. I hired some Hutterite children, or young men, to come up on weekends. No child labor. Some young people to come up and work sort of illegally with their religious act on Sunday. I'd send a van down, they'd get in. And at the end of the film, I found out they had pooled their money and bought a TV set to watch baseball games, which was against every Hutterite belief, but I got along great with the Hutterites, and I think they enjoyed having the film made so close to their land. They were also taking bets that there was no way I could get the house done on time.
Well, thinking about Days of Heaven, that's a movie that was conjured in my memory for me when I watched Killers of the Flower Moon, because when you watch those fields burning in Killers of the Flower Moon, that was one of the first things I thought of was Days of Heaven. I'm curious if there are, whether they're Easter eggs, whether they are lessons learned that you go, oh, this was the thing that I did on this film that makes it that much easier to sort of create the visual, the landscape, the buildings, any aspect of a world that you're creating from one film to another specific.
Hopefully we're all learning every day. I love the fire in Badlands. Terry had gotten the idea of renting or buying some wheat from the Hutterites, and we would mow 50 feet, then lift 50 feet of wheat, then mow 50 feet. So we had about 5 bands of wheat, and every night we would start one on fire and shoot. And if it got too hot, you could run to the next clearing, escape the heat. and it was a huge fire. We couldn't get the wheat to burn at night, so we had a diesel truck come and pour diesel fuel on the wheat. You couldn't do that today, they would arrest you, but it made an exciting fire that I've always loved, and I would go home every night smelling like diesel fuel, but so excited about what we had done. Anyway, when Marty wanted to do a fire of burning hay at Hale House, I had envisioned a similar thing, and I sort of planned it out, but he had in mind something very stylized, and it was a different approach, and it took me a while to adjust to it, but on my third viewing of the film, I realized how it was sort of a drug-induced vision of a fire and how important it was to the film and to Marty's style. So I've always listened to directors when it comes down to it. You know, they have the final say, and usually the writer-director has the best idea of what the film needs.
Well, you are obviously meticulously researched in your creation of these worlds, but obviously there is a juxtaposition between historical accuracy and, as you said, the vision of a filmmaker. I know that certainly you've made films yourself as a director. What are the lessons that you've learned in terms of juxtaposing, what could be fully accurate, but maybe not exactly what a filmmaker wants, and how do you, find a balance between those two?
I go crazy with research in the beginning and try to immerse myself as much as possible in the period of the film. And then there's a certain point where you need to just leave the research and start working from your gut to what feels right. And then there's certain things that the story requires. You either have to simplify images or combine images or forget images, but you always do it with a foundation of research in your cranium to draw from.
To ask Killers of the Flower Moon, I mean, you're literally building a town. How did you embark on the process of doing that? I know that there was a great New York Times piece that explored some of that, but can you talk about what conversations you had with Martin Scorsese about what he wanted and maybe what you wanted to bring that you thought would enhance the ideas that he had?
My first conversations with Marty was he told me he wanted to make a film that was truthful to the Osage people, that he wanted to incorporate as much of their knowledge as possible in the film, which I love because I think down deep I like making documentaries, and there was so much research. David Gran gave us all the research from his book. Marianne Bowers, who is a producer on the film and Marty's archivist, was daily collecting research. And some of it I was the first person to go through. They would get all this research. And for me, a beginning of understanding Molly's family was to know where her house was or what it was like. And there were a lot of urban legends about them living in mansions and driving pace arrows. But then when I showed up at Fairfax, I didn't find that. I found small craftsman homes of the teens and 20s, and Ford dealerships and Buick dealerships. And I got into the probate records of Lizzie Kyle, which is Molly's mother. And in that, the lawyer asked her, do you own your own home? And she said, no. And he said, well, where do you live? And she says, I live in the house I grew up in with my mother. So until that point in the script, she was living in a mansion. And I called or I talked to Marty, and I said, Marty, they didn't live in mansions, they lived in little houses. And he said, you mean I'll never get to see her come down the staircase? And he was thinking of Gone with the Wind and the big staircase and stuff. But he was so intent on making things real and natural, which also appealed to me, that he went with it instantly. And most of our communication had to do with factual stuff. And we made a couple of choices. We had to make Molly's house a little bigger than it was. It's just so we could get the camera in there. And Hale's house, we combined several houses and put it on his ranch, where I think at the time he was living in Fairfax. But there was so much research that, and we were shooting in Oklahoma, And because of COVID, there was a long period of time when I was hired for the film, but we hadn't started pre-production. So I just immersed myself in the research and had so much fun.
Well, one of the things that, one of the incredible sequences in Killers of the Flower Moon is this explosion that happens. And I want to talk to you as a production designer about what it's like, not just to create something that eventually on screen in some capacity gets exploded, but how you create the aftermath of that.
I went out to Oklahoma not knowing how we were going to do that, but I had a picture of Rita and Bill's house, what it looked like before it exploded. And about 2 blocks away from that, where that happened, I found a house that looked very similar. And in my mind, I thought, well, we can fix it up and shoot the exteriors and the interiors, then we'll go to a field somewhere and build a house that we can blow up. Well, when the location manager was going to negotiate with the 2 sisters, the 2 Osage sisters that own the house, I said to him, ask him if we can blow it up. And he came back the next day and they said yes. And I was mystified and excited, and I said, well, why did they say that? And he said that their grandfather lived in that house, their Osage grandfather, and he had a white wife, and she took all his money and made his life miserable, and they just wanted to do away with it. And they wanted to give the lot to their nephew. Well, I found out we couldn't blow up the house because of all kinds of EPA environments, and the neighbors were a little scared of it.
Understandably, perhaps.
We fixed up the house, we shot the interiors and the exteriors that we needed, and then we slowly picked it apart with a big excavator and put back together the remnants to look like an explosion. Painted a lot of things black and shot right there in the neighborhood. I had this big excavator driving over piles of dried timber out of the house to make debris that we could scatter all around the block. And I thought it turned out pretty well. It was no construction people involved. It was greensmen and decorators. And it's one of those challenges where you don't know how you're going to do it, but when it happens, it says, oh, it makes so much more sense.
Well, having recently I rewatched There Will Be Blood last night just to refresh my memory of how much I love the movie, but it reminds me of, in that film, you're creating something that eventually is going to get burned down. I'm curious, when you're doing that, I assume you're not building a derrick out of matchsticks so that later on you can burn it down. Are you, for a film like There Will Be Blood, how much were you building? And then how much were you building knowing that eventually it would be dismantled or destroyed? And how did you sort of accommodate the arc of that in the story?
In There Will Be Blood, we built everything real. I used the plans for a 1896 derrick, and it gave us a lumber list, so we were way ahead of the game. We didn't have to draw it. We just ordered the lumber from the lumber list. The houses, everything had to be built real because we were on a real location. And we had no set work. It was challenging because you're a victim of the weather, but it also, if something burns, it looks more real, because you put the right number of 2x4s in there, and you got the asphalt shingles or whatever it is. When we try to burn sets, they look like sets burning, and so I always try to build real structures as much as possible.
Is it harder as the further into your career because of the technological changes or just the cultural changes? I mean, in the 70s, you could blow something up or, and it feels like now when I watch The Bear, I'm like, why is there no fire in this actual kitchen where this show takes place? Are there things that you have to now figure out a different way to do because no longer is it safe or is it allowed to use real elements in that way?
Yeah, it's getting harder. Every period film I do, I go, oh, I'm glad I'm doing it now and not 10 years from now. But when I worked for the Cormans, if we needed black smoke, we just set a rubber tire on fire. They don't let you do that anymore. And what we did in There Will Be Blood, we took pans of diesel fuel and lit that and got black smoke. But now, more than not, it's visual effects to make black smoke. Black smoke is the hardest one to get. But that, you know, that's across the board. Anything that's dangerous to the crew or the neighbors or the people is forbidden, and we keep finding ways to work around it and get closer and closer to visual effects. Even on the house that we destroyed on Flowers of the Killer Moon, Apple had us take all the plaster off, any lead paint. So we pretty much started with the frame of a house. It was stripped down. It broke my heart because I was hoping to see, all those bits and pieces. But then when I looked at a lot of houses that exploded, that stuff disappears anyway. So.
Well, Paul, on the films that you worked with him on The Master and with There Will Be Blood, he was in such an exploratory storytelling mode. Like, he had these narratives that he had not locked at the point at which he was, when he was starting the film. I mean, he had a script, of course, but it was something where he didn't know exactly how it was all going to fit together. What does that keep you on your toes? Is that, are you just prepared within an inch of your life in a similar way with Terrence Malick, where it was like, well, whatever he's going to capture, I'm going to have something built there and ready for him? Or, are you having to be nimble and reactive as he's sort of figuring out what he wants to, focus on?
When I work with Paul, who is just a brilliant writer and director, I mean, his scripts are like books. He gave me 125 pictures of oil derricks when I first started that he had researched in writing the script. And we went down to Marfa. We rented this ranch. It was 50,000 acres. And like young kids, we walked around and we go, well, we could put the derrick on that hill and the church on that hill. And what if the Sunday house was in that valley over there? And I would be putting stakes in the ground and pieces of PVC to stick up so we could see the scale. And I really felt like we were children and God at the same time, sort of building this world. Paul is so immersed into the things that he makes, and that's my favorite way to work, is closely with a writer-director.
I want to talk also about, a film like The Revenant, although there are obviously these historical structures in that film, that's a film that when you think about it, you think about these natural areas and these sort of spaces that so much of the story takes place in. What does that require you to do? I mean, are you, location scouting? Are you, how do you sort of figure out where we're going to have a giant, bear fighting man scene, or whatever it is, or is your focus largely on those physical structures in the same way that you build them for the other films?
No, I think locations are as much a tool of the production designer as a built set. And the challenge of Revenant was that a man crawled for 600 miles or 200 miles saying nothing. And how do you make that interesting? And how do you make it look like he's gone anywhere? So we were looking for locations that were challenging, spectacular, and different. And we needed to shoot in the Rockies because Chivo always wants to be looking west or toward the sunset, so everything's backlit. And we couldn't do it in British Columbia because you'd be looking at the ocean. And so we were forced to be in the Rockies, which was very cold and full of grizzly bears. And I came close a couple of times to running on a grizzly and exited backwards as quickly as I could. One location, we saw a location, there was a stream running through trees, and Alejandro said, I'd love to have a forest with a river running through it. Well, those things don't really exist. But one day, that was the one location I couldn't find. I'm hiking down a creek, and I see water pouring out of the forest into the creek. And I go up in there, and the creek had done a horseshoe around this piece of land, and some trees had fallen down and blocked the creek and sent the creek through the forest. So it was exactly what Alejandro had wanted. And I remember being so excited. And then remembering I was in an area by myself that's a home to grizzly bears. And we had even had a grizzly bear come up to the catering truck at one point. And the location manager had kind of like tried to scoot them off with his car, but they're so powerful and so strong, and every once in a while people get killed by them. And I felt blessed, by all my ancestors that kind of kept an eye out for me.
Well, Iñárritu, I mean, he is so committed to authenticity. I mean, that film, it feels like as much for the audience as it is for Leonardo DiCaprio's character, an endurance test to survive this thing, I'm curious where maybe, just looking back at it, you were able to, use a little showmanship to make these things that are, even in these real spaces, a little bit more, cinematic, while not, exposing Leonardo DiCaprio to grizzly bears in the middle of the Rocky Mountains.
Well, Leo was exposed to horrible weather. One day it was minus 35 degrees. We had a lot of snow. They were all difficult locations to go to, and he was also in the water for a lot of that stuff. So it was difficult. But Alejandro is so passionate and it's so effective. I mean, when he stands behind the camera and people are fighting, he's taking every punch. He doesn't stand still. And he also rehearses every scene before he starts the movie. So we started rehearsing scenes in the summertime, and we started shooting the movie in the fall. And he'd come back and he'd say, well, this doesn't look like it did. Suddenly it's got snow on it and stuff. So although he had rehearsed the scene, the environment kept changing, but he went with it. And he and Chibo worked so closely together, and lighting became so important that we'd work all day to get ready for a shot at the end of the day, or 2 shots at the end of the day. And that's what we did for the whole film. We'd show up at location, and we had cranes and whatever equipment was needed, and the shot was worked out, and then as the sun started to go down and it looked beautiful, we'd shoot until we couldn't shoot anymore. The next day, moved to another location.
Wow. Well, we're about to wrap up, but I wanted to ask you, maybe just as you're looking at, your career, we talked about sort of the changes in culture and technology and things like that. How much work that you would have done practically years ago, how much easier, how much more difficult is it for somebody who wants to be a production designer now to follow in your footsteps? Would it be easier for them to do a lot of the things that you did because they can Google a lot of it and find it? Is it more difficult because the stuff that you would draw upon is not available? I mean, is it easier today now than when you started, when you were working with, Terrence on Badlands to become a production designer in the way that you were?
I don't think of making films as being easy, but I think of it being fun, challenging. A perfect example is Ruth DeYoung, who is nominated for Oppenheimer. Her first film was working with me on There Will Be Blood, and she was a natural. And she sort of picked up my style of a hands-on, the construction coordinator at the end of There Will Be Blood gave me a hammer. But she picked up on that, and she's carried it through. And I saw her last night as she won the Art Directors Guild Award for Best Period Film. And she said, look, my crew is small. I mean, we worked for 8 years with a 3-man art department and 1 designer, and David Crank and Ruth and I, and she's carried that on and doing it successfully on big films.
Well, listen, thank you so much for coming out today. We really appreciate it. Do you have a favorite film among, whether it's among the ones that they're showing or one that you've made that you're most proud of?
It's like asking somebody which child they like best. I love them all.
Gotcha. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming out today. Let's have another round of applause for Jack.